Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. Today we're continuing our Sliptember theme this month on the podcast, and therefore I'm going to do a deep dive into CHIMES, which are the 6 reasons that people slip. Now, when I've ever been called into a business over the years and they've been struggling with slips and falls, they have something in common, which is that they're not performing well in these 6 areas. On the other side of the coin, where I've come across businesses that are doing really well, having very few accidents, very few injuries, very few claims and low claims costs, it's because they're doing well on all these 6 areas. So it's a really important framework, really interesting, really valuable stuff. And basically, in this session, I break down CHIMES, I go through each of the 6 and give you some key ideas, some key thoughts, key principles to consider. Hope you enjoy it, get something from it. What I'd certainly recommend, and I talk about this at the end, is using our slip prevention scorecard to measure your performance on CHIMES. So once you've listened to this and you've got a good idea of how CHIMES works and what it all means, why don't you go ahead, visit our website at scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk and see how you're doing. It'll take you about 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes. You answer a series of questions and you'll get a score overall, plus you'll get a score for each of the CHIMES. That means you can start to see where you're at. You get that kind of baseline. You can see where you're doing well, where you've got room for improvement, and therefore you can start to take steps to reduce your risk. Let's get into it then and join my deep dive into CHIMES. And remember, do take the scorecard. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
So yeah, death and taxes might be inevitable, slips are not. That's definitely my lived experience. So why are slips and falls such a big problem? 3 kind of drivers to consider. In spite of our best efforts, because we are doing stuff, we do have controls in place, we do have policies and procedures. This is still the biggest cause of accident, injury and claim, over £1 billion of insurance claims every year in the UK. And interestingly, not many people know this, but if you look at your business insurance premium, about 20% of it will be attributed to slip claims, potential slip claims. So there's an opportunity there from a financial perspective to get on top of this, have some conversations with your insurer and bring that down. When we speak to safety professionals, what we hear is that the vast majority of them, in fact 85% of them, would say that slips is a relevant risk to their organisation. But nonetheless, they're juggling priorities. They are having to deal with all sorts of things. And therefore, this issue, although it's big, is not getting necessarily the same amount of attention as it is in terms of the relevancy and priority. And then we have these 4 common mindset gaps, which I've bundled into something I call the slip problem, which we spoke about last week. And so what that means is we're dealing with this issue in quite a basic and sort of superficial way. Just quickly, why am I talking about this? What's my background? So I do various bits of content every week around safety and risk, but I specialize in this field of slips. So this is my real area of specialism. Worked in some high profile cases in this area, and won some awards about things to do with slips and falls, support some leading brands, and do lots of content stuff with people like IOSH and IIRSM. My business has helped several thousand sites to reduce their slip and fall risks over the years, and at last count we're stopping about £10 million of claims a year. So when I say that slips aren't inevitable, I know that to be true because we're helping clients to prove that point. So today we're going to talk about CHIMES. So we've set that context of why slips is a problem, and the fact that it's a big problem, and it's a problem that, in spite of the time and effort that we are currently putting in, isn't going anywhere, because it hasn't been improving. If anything, it's been increasing slightly as a problem over the last decade. So what can we do about it? My big thought, my key idea for today, is that we need to go a little bit deeper and a little bit broader than we have been doing. So we need to get away from kind of the superficial stuff of, we put a sign out, our cleaner cleans the floor, we have spillage control, we have some entrance matting, into looking at this in a bit more depth, and we also need to look at it in a bit more breadth, because there are these 6 factors that we all need to consider. So CHIMES is an acronym, and it is going to be explained just now. So C in CHIMES stands for contamination. And what I'm going to do in a minute, guys, once I've given you the overview, is I'm going to do a deep dive into each of these and give you some key ideas for all 6 areas, and some insights and some things to think about. So contamination is simply what is on the floor. So if a floor is clean and dry, then it's very unlikely that it's going to be slippery. Whenever we introduce some kind of contaminant, whether that be, a liquid, it could be a dry contaminant, semi-solid, any number of things, that's going to change the risk profile. Heel is all about footwear. So in order for somebody to slip, there has to be a floor, of course, but there has to be a foot. So what role does footwear play, and how can we control that? Individual is all of the human factors. So if we're doing different types of movements, then that can increase the likelihood of slipping. If we're distracted, if we are rushing, if we're a bit older, that can increase the chances of us slipping. And obviously, if we're older as well, the chances of us suffering a more serious and more expensive injury are higher too. So what can we do around the human factors? M is for maintenance. This splits into 3, wear and tear, change of use, and cleaning. Environment is, yes, a little bit about kind of the weather, and things like condensation and rain and ice and snow, but it's also about the built environment. So thinking about lighting, thinking about entrance matting, thinking about steps and stairs, thinking about slopes and ramps. And then surface is the floor. So clearly you've got to slip on something. What is that surface, and to what extent is it safe or not when it's contaminated? So this is the model, and this is the process, I suppose, that we run through with all of our clients when we first go and meet them. And what I've found over my sort of 12 years doing this is that when I go in and find a client that's performing well, and they have a very low relative rate of slip and fall incidents, they tend to be doing well on a lot of these 6 areas. Conversely, when I go in to somebody that's struggling, and we set this out and we start talking about these 6 factors, the typical sorts of responses I get are, oh wow, I didn't know there was as much detail to this as that. We're probably only looking at 1 or 2 of these. And so, there's a clear correlation between high performance on CHIMES and the outcome of accident rates. So let's do a bit of thinking about contamination. So there's 2 things I want to talk about here to start with. There's a difference between intentional contamination and accidental contamination. So if you think about the use of yellow signs, when should yellow signs be used? They should only really be used in 2 scenarios. One is intentional, one is accidental. So intentional would be where we are knowingly and deliberately making floors wet or contaminated, for example, normally when we're cleaning. Accidental would be when there is an unexpected contaminant on the floor, for example, a spillage. So yellow signs should only really be used in those two scenarios. So we need to understand and think about contamination in our buildings. To what extent is it intentional? Which areas are intentional? When's that happening? What's accidental? When's that happening? Then we need to think about visible and invisible, and we're using an iceberg analogy for this. The small amount of the iceberg is visible above the water, invisible below the line. Think about COVID. You can't see COVID. COVID could be on a surface and you simply cannot see that it's there. However, if you can see that a surface is dirty, then there's obviously a much greater chance that it could be harbouring COVID. What we've learnt in the pandemic is that not all contamination is visible to the naked eye. So we need to be thinking about not just what looks clearly dirty, because that will have an effect on slip resistance, but also contamination that might be invisible. Let's think about clean versus clean. So on the left-hand side here is a photograph of some washrooms in a shopping centre. And when you would walk into that washroom, you would look at the floor. It would look pretty good. It would look consistent. And you'd probably assume that it was clean. It's not until you actually clean a patch that you see that, in fact, it's just consistently dirty. Another example on the right of the screen here from a different shopping centre, where again you would look at that floor, you'd think it's got a nice shine to it, it looks consistent, it looks even, it's probably pretty clean. Again, it's not until you clean a patch that you see just how much contamination is being harboured within the surface, and any level of contamination is going to affect the slip resistance of a floor. What we're looking for when we're trying to manage contamination is I suppose proof, not promises, and I'll use that phrase again later, I think. So there are ways of quantifying how clean or free of contamination a surface is. You can do various swabs. There's a product that we like called Fresh Check, which is a spray. You spray it on the surface, and if it changes colour, it's dirty. If it doesn't, then it's clean. And it's the same kind of principles we would use in a food safe area to check if surface preparation surfaces were clean or not. We can use that on floors to assess how contaminated or not they are, and then we can sort of take some action, because again, if we can have surfaces that are clean and dry, it's very, very, very unlikely that someone's ever going to slip. Proof, not promises. Is contamination always an issue? Good question. What you'll find is that on smoother floors, any amount of contamination could make a big, big difference. Whereas on more textured floors, they can withstand a certain level of contamination. And that's why in a kitchen, for example, we would typically find a textured tile or resin or something, or an outro, something similar like that, because we know that that environment's going to get a bit greasy, and so a bit of texture on the floor can help to withstand some degree of contamination. But there will be a point at which the contamination becomes too great for pretty much any surface. And think about layers as well. So even if you've got a anti-slip floor or a slip-resistant floor, it might well perform okay in a slip test, for example, when it's clean. But if there's a layer of contamination on top of it, some of the pores get clogged up. Effectively, you end up with a layer of residue on top, and then your foot is touching the sort of greasy, slippery residue, not the floor itself. So contaminant plus water is a different story than just if something's wet. So think about layers of contamination. Okay, there's some ideas around contamination. Let's give you some thoughts on heel. So this is all about footwear. Now, a big key question is somebody wearing any shoes or not? Because there's a very big difference between the sole of one's foot and the sole of a shoe. So if we are looking at, for example, a hotel bathroom, we would be considering the use of that environment in both shod and barefoot conditions. Whereas if we were looking at a shopping centre, we would hope that people would be wearing shoes in that shopping centre, and therefore we'd be looking just at a shod environment. But obviously, a shoe is not a shoe, and both from the perspective of shoes that we might wear in our leisure, which can range from flip-flops to high heels to trainers to brogues to anything in between, and shoes that we could wear at work, there's a difference. Something to think about is where footwear is being worn. So if you are providing footwear to your staff, the type of footwear they're going to need working in a shopping centre is likely to be different than the type of footwear they would need working around a poolside and working in a kitchen, or, for example, working outside if you're doing grounds maintenance and walking on grass and things like that. So where you're wearing footwear is a factor to consider. Just like with floors, you should think about zones as well. So where are you able to control footwear? And you can't really control what customers are wearing on their feet. So if you think of a restaurant, for example, which I'm showing here on the screen, there are certain areas of that building where you can't control footwear all the time, and there are some where you can. So in the kitchen, you can always control footwear. In the office, you can always control footwear. In the front of house areas, you can't. So think about where you can actually control footwear as well. Just to finish on footwear, the key point, I suppose, is that if you are able to control footwear, just bear in mind that a safety shoe does not necessarily mean slip resistant. You might go to a shop and buy, what looks like a safety shoe, but the level of slip resistance provided by that sole is it might be okay, but it could be not very good at all. You need to be specifying correctly. Individual, so human factors. So we've got two things to think about here. We've got physiological and psychological. So the older we are, for example, if you are an 80-year-old lady, for example, you're much more likely to slip than if you are a 20-year-old man. You're also more likely to hurt yourself too. Psychological is thinking about how we're looking at things, what are we seeing, and how we trained, how we're thinking, that kind of stuff. Anything that we are doing that is not walking at a normal speed in a straight line is going to increase the potential for us to slip and fall. So if we are pushing, pulling, carrying, twisting, turning, rushing, all of this stuff is going to make us more likely to slip and fall. So from the perspective of managing workflows, thinking about how we can train staff, thinking about how we can set up the buildings to encourage people to move in a more controlled and measured way, all of these things we should take into account. If we could minimize the amount of this kind of activity that's happening, then we would see fewer accidents. I'll give you an example of this. We were working with Network Rail at Euston Station. If you've ever been to Euston Station, the concourse is at a higher level than the platforms, and there are these long ramps that go down. And what they found, particularly for one of these ramps, was that they were having accidents on the ramp. And it was a combination of the fact that, as I'm going to talk about later, if you've got a slope, you need more grip, but also people were rushing to their trains, carrying stuff, pulling stuff, etc. So what we suggested they did there was to try to slow people down by putting in some barriers, and that did seem to work. Yellow signs. One of the most common methods that people seek to employ to mitigate slip risk, or that seemingly is what they're doing, is yellow signs. Are these effective? Well, as I said earlier, really, there's only two cases where you should be using a yellow sign. One during pre-planned cleaning, when the floor is wet and then it should be removed, and secondly during a spillage. And actually, how you should deal with the spillage is not like this photograph in the middle, where there was obviously a spillage. It's mopped around in a big wet area and then left to dry. You should be drying that floor and staying by it, and only really returning the floor to use when it's dry. Probably the highest profile slip that we've had in the UK and that I was involved in was a gentleman who slipped in a co-op supermarket. He banged the back of his head and he passed away. And there was at least one, if not two, yellow signs there where this happened. The yellow sign didn't stop him from slipping. It didn't stop him from severely injuring himself, clearly. It didn't stop a civil claim against the supermarket, and it didn't stop a criminal fine of £400,000 against the supermarket. So they had signs out, they still had an accident, they still ended up with a bill well over £500,000. They still ended up with one of their customers sadly passing away, and all of that adverse publicity. So yellow signs are not the answer. And in Ireland, the HSA, which is the equivalent of the HSE here in the UK, did some work, and they said that a review of slip, trip and fall accidents where the floor was being wet cleaned showed that signs were ineffective in preventing all slips, trips and falls on wet floors. So that's something from a government body over in Ireland. Don't just take my word for it. Maintenance. Maintenance, as I said earlier, splits into three. So there's cleaning, there's wear and tear, and there's change of use. Floors will change over time due to wear and tear. So think of going to a church, for example, and you're going to see a floor that is, if it's been there for years, one of these old stone floors there for hundreds of years, it's worn smoother. That's going to change the slip resistance compared to when the floor was installed. The requirements on floors can change through change of use. So if you think about reconfiguring an office or reconfiguring a retail shop from, let's say, a clothes retailer to a butcher's in an extreme case, the floor that was installed on the floor on the surface for the clothes retailer is probably not going to be acceptable for the butchers. And then cleaning is really, really important. Cleaning alone can have, as in this example here, a 500,000 times reduction in risk. So this floor here, which was in the changing room of a hotel leisure centre, it's a textured floor, so they assumed it was safe. When it was slip tested and it was dirty, as you can see on the left hand side of this image, it scored a pendulum test value of less than 20, and therefore it had a 1 in 2 risk exposure. After it was cleaned on the right hand side, not only does it look a lot nicer, not only is it now hygienic, but it actually achieved a slip resistance value which gave it less than a 1 in a million risk. So the difference between, it's the same floor, nothing's been done to the floor to alter the state of the floor other than it's been properly cleaned. So the difference in cleaning is massive. And most people don't go, even cleaning contractors, don't go down to the level of detail they need to understand what effect their cleaning method is having on the slip safety of a floor. If you are overseeing cleaning in your business, here's another acronym that you can use to manage this better, or to think about the principles of what makes an effective cleaning regime. So I call this ROTAs. R is regularity. So how frequently are we cleaning? Often surfaces are not cleaned frequently enough. O is organization. So this is all about the management of that cleaning regime. So knowing what we're doing, knowing what outcomes we're looking to achieve, and having the skills to oversee that. T is time. This is a big one. You cannot clean 1,000 square meters in 15 minutes. Yet, often when we visit, for example, leisure centres, they have these massive poolsides, massive changing rooms, and cleaning is left to the very last minute at the end of the shift. And they've got 20 minutes. These young lifeguards, when they want to get home, and they're told to clean hundreds of square meters, and it's just simply not possible to clean them effectively in that amount of time. A is ability. So this is all about the staff, so the training, the skill set, having the right knowledge. And then S is the system. So this is the methodology that's used. So what chemicals are we using, if any? What equipment are we using? What methodology are we using? For example, are we mopping versus using a machine? If we're using a machine, are we using a brush or a pad? And so on and so forth. So some things to think about in terms of cleaning. On to environment then. Environment I'd split into 4 key areas. So one is the weather and its effects. So if we're in Manchester versus Mauritius, the weather is going to be different, and therefore that's going to have a different effect on our risk profile. Next is the built environment. Then we've got steps and stairs, and then ramps and slopes. Probably the biggest thing to talk about in environment is matting. So how many buildings have entrance matting? Most. How many buildings have adequate matting for the size and scope and usage of their building? Very, very, very few. I live in London, and I regularly walk around between meetings or locally in the area, and I go and see supermarket convenience stores. Now, these are busy places that have hundreds of people coming into them, and yet they typically will have matting that's very, very shallow. It might be half a metre or something like that. Why does matting exist? Matting exists to try to remove contamination from someone's feet before they go inside. Now, think about this logically. If you've got a mat which is only 50 centimetres, how many footsteps can you get on that mat versus how many feet have you actually got where you could have contamination on the bottom of it? The likelihood is with a 50 centimetre mat, you're only going to place 1 foot on the mat anyway. And even if you did place 2 feet on that mat, is that mat effective at removing the contamination? So matting is a big, big area and a cause. People look at it as a solution, but it's actually a cause quite often because people perceive the solution and therefore don't take other steps to reduce the risk of accidents. Now, HSE gave some guidance along with the Entrance Flooring Association, and they said that the depth of matting, so in other words, from the threshold of the building to the edge of the matting, how deep, how far into the building should it go, should be driven by your peak traffic flow per hour. So if you have a low peak traffic flow per hour, which was set for some reason at 78 people, you should have 3 to 4 meters of built-in matting. If you have a medium usage, which was 400 people per hour, you should have 6 to 7 meters of built-in matting. And if you have a high usage, which was set at 800 people per hour or more, you should have 8 to 10 meters of built-in matting. Now, I have visited either for work or just as a consumer or a user of these buildings, some of the very busiest buildings in the country, from train stations to shopping centres to stadia, and almost none of them have anywhere near 8 to 10 metres of matting. Very few of them even have 3 to 4 metres of matting. So there's a big, big problem there. And the point with CHIMES is, ideally, we'd be managing all 6 of these areas really well. But if we find there's an area that we can't manage very well, so if you're a cleaning contractor, if you're a facilities management company and you take over a building with a high level of footfall that doesn't have very deep entrance matting, it's quite difficult for you to do anything about that. So if you can't manage this better, you need to put more emphasis on some of the other areas. And here's a good example from a train station where they've got matting. I'd say that's probably 2.5 meters to 3 meters of matting. But here's the key question. Is your matting working? Stand inside on a wet day like this and just look, is the floor getting wet? And here the floor is sodden with water. So that matting isn't working, and therefore you can't be relying on the matting if it doesn't work as a control mechanism. What people often think is, well, I've got matting, so therefore my floor is dry. It's not a wet area. I don't need to worry about it being a wet area. Here's a great example where that simply isn't the case. This floor should be considered as a foreseeably wet area because on a wet day, it gets wet. Another thing to think about is consistency of floors and changes of floors. So this was a photograph that I took in a commercial kitchen of a resin floor, and you can see the bottom half of the image is showing a very textured, rough floor, and then at the top it's smooth and shiny, and that's an inconsistency in the laying of that floor. And the difference in risk when we slip tested this floor was 500,000 times from one footstep to the other. So consistency of floor surfaces is really important to maintain safety, but also think about where floor surfaces are changing from one to another and if they have different levels of slip resistance as well. And then finally, let's move on to surface. What I say about surface is that it's really arguably the most important. Many people would say, if you ask them, that human factors, the individual, is the most important. But the thing with that is it's quite hard to control, whereas surface is always relevant, because if someone's going to slip, their foot's going to have to touch a floor, and it's always within your control to some extent. So what my experience says to me is if you've got a good surface to start with, but you're not doing so well on the other 5 chimes, the floor could well still be safe when wet, and therefore you might still avoid lots of these accidents. Whereas if you've got an ineffective surface, so let's say, for example, you put a polished marble tile around a swimming pool, using an extreme example, it doesn't really matter how well you do on the other chimes, because fundamentally the floor is slippery when wet. It's a slippery floor, and it's going to get wet because it's around a swimming pool, so therefore you're always going to have that risk. So the floor is the one that I would focus a lot on. What's interesting is that when you look at chimes, 50% of it really relates to the floor in some way. So you've got surface, you've got contamination, you've got maintenance. These are all about the floor. And some data from the US in the hospitality sector would ring true with that. They would say that 52% of causation is down to the floor, for example, of accidents in that sector. Now, the problem is with thinking about the floor surface, it's impossible to tell just by looking at a floor how safe it is or isn't. So as we saw from the example in the hotel where the cleaning made a big difference, you could look at a floor and it might look very textured, and you might assume therefore that it's safe, but if it isn't perfectly clean, it might not be safe. You could look at a floor and it looks textured and you'd assume it's safe, but actually the profile of the texture is such that it doesn't actually work at achieving good slip resistance, so that it doesn't give you that mechanical key when the heel strikes the floor. So it's impossible to know just by looking at a floor whether it's safe or not. What you can do is use a test, and in the UK the test that's used by the HSE and it's used by the courts is called a pendulum test. It mimics a heel striking a floor, and it gives you a number called a pendulum test value. You can test any floor in situ, not necessarily just samples from a lab or a factory, and we can also use it to measure how much contamination there is and the effect of cleaning regimes as well. There are other tests available, but what I would say is, if you have another test that says the floor was safe and you're standing in court up against somebody from the HSE with a pendulum test that says the floor was unsafe, there's only going to be one winner of that argument. So you should stick to using this as the gold standard. Here's a video of the test being used. So this chap's going to spray the floor. He's going to release the foot of the pendulum, and it's called a pendulum because it swings. As it swings down, it's going to strike the floor, and then it's going to swing through and push a pointer onto a gauge on the left-hand side of the frame of the pendulum. So spray the floor, release the foot, swings through, pushes to the pointer. I'll show you that again. Sprays the floor, releases the foot, swings down, and what that's doing, as you can see, is it's mimicking the heel strike. So when we are walking along, we plant our foot on the floor at that kind of angle with a certain level of velocity and a certain level of weight, and whether or not the floor is slippery is going to determine how likely we might be to slip and fall. So this is mimicking what's happening there in real life. The pendulum test gives you a score called a pendulum test value, and there are three categories of risk. There's high, which is a score of up to 24, moderate, which is a score between 25 and 35, and low, which is a score of 36 or above. Furthermore, the HSE did some correlation work, and they deduced that if you had a pendulum test value of 36 or greater, then the risk exposure of someone slipping was 1 in a million. Whereas if you were in the position of having a pendulum test value of 24, then there would be an exposure risk of 1 in 20. So if you are anything like me, then you'd probably rather be at the green end of that spectrum and have a floor surface that is only requiring 1 in a million people to have a risk of slipping, rather than having 5% of people having a chance of slipping. Now, that risk exposure doesn't mean that 1 in 20 people are going to slip. It means that they could slip. So you're not going to see 1 in 20 people actually slipping. Otherwise, the numbers I shared at the start would be blown out of the water. But the great thing about the test is that we can move away from guessing. We can move towards science, and if we can quantify where we are, we know where we stand, and then we can take the appropriate action. If we slip test our floor and it's in the green, even when it's wet, well, that's great, because we've now got the evidence that we need, and we know we're doing what we need to do. We can be confident and certain of what we're doing. If, however, we do a test and we find that we've got a floor in the red or the amber zone, then at least now we know, right? So we can then take steps to address that and try and move ourselves to a better place. So there's two main benefits of getting the testing. One is to know where you stand and then be able to take steps to reduce the risk and have fewer accidents. But the other one is around being able to defend claims. David Scott here is a lawyer who defends claims for a living, and he was chatting to me on my podcast, and he said if you have compliant slip test data, you should expect to defend that claim. The context for that was we were talking about an extreme example. We were talking about a swimming pool. We were talking about the floor being wet. We were talking about somebody slipping, and we were talking about somebody legitimately hurting themselves after they slipped. Now, most people would think, they would assume that if someone legitimately hurts themselves, if they definitely slipped, and if the floor was wet, then you're banged to rights and you're going to have to pay out the claim. And that simply isn't true. Your obligation is not to prevent all accidents. Your obligation is to take reasonable and practicable steps. But if you can prove that you've done that, and if you can evidence that through some science, particularly from a third party, using the HSE approved method, then you are proving you've discharged your duty of care, and therefore it is an accident. Accidents can still happen. So that's a run through of CHIMES. I rattled through those as quickly as I could, bearing in mind there's a lot of depth to go through, and I haven't gone anywhere near the full depth, but I've given you some key ideas for each of these. What I would say is that this just requires a fresh approach. Think back to the data I shared at the start, where year after year for the last decade plus, 30% of our accidents, injuries and claims have been slips. So what we're doing now isn't working. We need to go from good to great, and how to do that is to take advantage of these 6 areas. They all sort of slightly interrelate. They all have different levels of depth you can go to. There's scientific ways of quantifying elements for all of these, so you can really go to town on this and go into a lot of depth. But the key idea is, if we're doing well in all of these areas, we should be standing ourselves in a very good position to prevent accidents and defend claims. Next steps that I'd recommend is, if you haven't done this already, is use what we have called our slip prevention scorecard. So this is a online self-assessment tool, and basically you spend about 3 or 4 minutes answering some questions, and it will then give you a score for each of the chimes. So you'll be able to see on that matrix of 6 areas, where you're currently doing well, where you're doing best, and where you've got room for improvement. And that will start to clarify in your mind and give you a bit of a baseline, a benchmark for where you are now. And then you'll know which of these areas you need to improve upon and in what order. So if you scored 80% for 3 of the areas, 60% for 2, and 30% for 1, you should absolutely make a start on that one area where you scored lowest. Try and get that up to as high a level as you can, and then move on from there. So what you get is this kind of dashboard after you've done the scorecard. So you get an overall score, and then you'll get a score for each of the chimes, so you can start to see where you are doing well and where you've got room for improvement. I'm going to pop the URL into the chat, but it's scorecard.slipsafety.co.uk to do the scorecard. And then once you've done the scorecard, we can hop onto a Zoom and chat it through. So I can give you some ideas based on your scores, share with you some examples of people that are in similar sectors to you and what they've done to improve, or if you've got particular areas of challenge and perhaps there's nothing relevant in your own sector, I could share with you some examples of what people in other sectors have done that had a similar challenge to you and tried to overcome them as well. So thanks very much for listening in on Chimes. Just a quick final plug about Sliptember. Anything that you can think of that we could do together to publicise Sliptember, to raise awareness on slips and falls, to get people more aware of Chimes, to get people using the scorecard, would be very much appreciated. I'm going to open it up to any questions. What I'd really love to know is any sort of light bulb moments or anything that really stands out that you didn't know before. That's what I'd really like to get out of this, so I can see that check that I'm landing things in the right place. So let us know in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and give us some reactions. Which of these areas hadn't you thought about before? Which of these areas do you now think, we could do more on? Or actually, where are you doing pretty well, and what are you doing that's working for you? And then lastly, next week on the Roundtable, I'm going to get on my high horse, and I'm going to be talking about slips, trips and falls, stop this folly. So STF. What does that mean in summary? It means that by bunching together slips, trips and falls, we're doing a great disservice to the world. We're arguably causing a lot of damage and a lot of risk, and so we need to get over that. Thanks, Isaac. Appreciate the comments. Glad that it has landed with you. Kieran, thank you very much too. Thank you. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to let me know, and if not, then we'll wrap the session up. Do join us next week. Great insights. Thank you, Nadia. Do join us next week for Slips, Trips, Falls, Stop the Folly, and do get involved with Sliptember, and definitely go ahead and take the slip prevention scorecard and let us know how you get on with it. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Okay, guys, sounds like no questions. I must have done a good job. Thanks very much for joining, and look forward to seeing you next week for another Safety Roundtable.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.